In today's episode, let's talk a bit about heat waves and how they permanently influence our oceans. I am Badrinarayan and this is Research Bites, your dose of science news. Europe, a continent where a tropical person would relish frosty climates, snowy peaks and oblique sun rays, experienced two of the hottest months as temperatures in Central and Western Europe soared up to an unprecedented 46 degrees Celsius. Even Scandinavian cities like Jingle, where huge mirrors are installed to strengthen the oblique sun rays, didn't feel the need for such paraphernalia in the wake of the searing heat wave. The tepidness in ever-cold areas of the tundras felt more like Middle Eastern summer. Speaking of heat waves, a similar event had struck our own backyard this year. Parts of northwestern India and Pakistan were scorched in the month of June as temperatures rose to 51 degrees Celsius. To give you some reference, the hottest temperature ever recorded in the world is 56 degrees Celsius. And that makes the European version seem rather benign, doesn't it? The event, however, attributed to irregular El Niño and deforestation, killed anywhere between 200 and 300 people in the Indian subcontinent alone. While the extreme heat also strangely coincided with droughts in South India, as ill-prepared residents had to flee from arid landscapes. It all started in June 2019 for Europe. High-pressure regions in North Africa summoned warm air across the Mediterranean. The winds scorched Italy, Spain, and the rest of southern Europe. The event culminated in July as the heat swept across France, Germany, Holland, Luxembourg, Scandinavia, and the UK. The scorching heatwave disrupted ventilation systems in barns, killing thousands of cattle, and the unexpected rise in temperatures disturbed transportation and trade in the UK and Europe. You might think of this as a seemingly temporary spin-off of the event, but more serious consequences were felt in Greenland. But more about it later. The immediate threat, however, is not apparently austere. At first glance, the issue is no more than a few unusually hot days that one may dismiss. But things are getting quite critical. To fully fathom the gravity of the matter, it is imperative to understand what a heat wave is and what it entails. Simply put, a heat wave is a set of consecutive days when temperatures spike past the predicted highest temperatures for those days. In other words, when high pressure in the upper atmosphere forces air downwards, trapping and eventually building up heat, the event causes unusual variations or spikes in temperature. Since heat waves are generally characterized by humidity and low wind speeds, population density and concrete structures in urban spaces especially play a major role by intensifying ground temperatures. However, heat waves are not uncommon events. Meteorological anomalies or pressure differences cause a few to occur at different times around the world. In fact, they indirectly increase wildfires, droughts, power outages, and mortalities every year. Despite best efforts, large areas of forests in Europe have gone up in flames, releasing more greenhouse gases and contributing to the prevalent heat wave. Meteorologists also claim that large parts of Europe are likely to witness such events on a yearly basis, while the yearly average could soar up by 4 degrees Celsius by 2040. Although Athens in 1977 observed a record high temperature of 46 degrees Celsius, the years 2015 to 2018 logged the highest temperatures, making the top 4 of the hottest temperatures ever recorded according to the World Meteorological Organization. This brings us to the long-term repercussions of the species exterminating concern that most of us are aware of: climate catastrophe. Despite exceptional efforts, governments can only remedy short-term mires while the looming threat of climate change grows bigger than ever. The extraordinary heat in Europe was followed by a dramatic cascade of ice plummeting into the waters in Greenland. Vast swathes of ice sheets melted in quick succession and rendered a once icy landscape into fettered pieces of tiny floating island tableaus in the Arctic Ocean. The meltdown in Greenland was so apparent that in many places children were seen playing in the water clad in summer wear instead of thick insulating thermal wear typical of people living in the cold countries. To put the melting into perspective, as on 29th of August, the heat wave had already turned 400 billion tons of ice into water within a 2-month period. With a daily maximum of almost 12.5 billion tons, the event had befallen 50 years earlier than predicted. Although ice melts naturally when the sun shines directly over the ice sheets during the summer months every year, it is usually restored by fresh snowfall later on in the year. But in 2019, snowfall over the region was very little compared to previous years, and by the time the heat wave struck in July, over 40% of the ice was on the verge of melting. This was well above the rate usually observed during that time of the year. According to Mike Sparrow, a climate expert from the World Meteorological Organization, heat waves are getting 10 times more frequent than they were a century ago. Ted Scambos, a glaciologist from the University of Colorado, discussing with CBS News, said that the Arctic actually amplifies the meltdown by 2.5 times. The Arctic has large amounts of permafrost, or permanently frozen ground, found in these high latitudes. As they melt, they could release large amounts of strong greenhouse gases such as methane and hydrocarbons. These gases expedite the process of melting. Scambos also says that the loss of snow and ice in the Arctic and melting snow in Greenland due to steady rise of greenhouse gases absorb more heat and lead to further melting. Most people overlook that these glaciers balance the tropical climates of the equator. They cause differences in pressure that lead to wind patterns we see around the world today. Every wind on the planet owes its existence to the icy climates of the tundras, and a torrential meltdown of this magnitude disrupts natural pressure difference otherwise observed between the Arctic and the tropics, which intensifies storms and causes more erratic weather patterns. Moreover, the prevailing play of ice and fire, lyrically speaking of course, has severely influenced the world's oceans. Martin Stendal, a Danish climate expert, says that the 48-hour meltdown in Greenland between July 31st and August 1st released enough water to fill a giant swimming pool the size of Germany with 20 centimeters of water. And if the whole of Greenland's ice were to melt, it would increase the sea levels by 7.5 meters, burying thousands of kilometers of coastlines and tens of coastal cities 2 stories deep under the ocean and rendering them uninhabitable. This is predicted to happen by the end of this millennium. But at the current rate of melting, it is estimated that sea levels could rise as much as 33 centimeters by the turn of this century alone. An observably crippling outcome of climate change is seen in Jakarta, as the city is sinking by about 7.5 meters every year. The Indonesian government cites climate change as one of the reasons to shift its capital to a yet-to-be-constructed city in the Borneo island. Additionally, since the ocean's topography is not flat and varies largely, water levels don't rise at a constant rate across the globe. This is particularly noticeable along the eastern coast of the US and the northern Indian Ocean, where sea levels rise 1.5 times quicker than the global average. While this doesn't qualify as a direct consequence of the heat wave, it is a byproduct of the climatic variations that affect some regions more severely than others. However, changing climatic patterns in the North Atlantic, such as El Niño, and shifting monsoon patterns in the North Indian Ocean have also contributed sizably to the growth. We are pretty much in for a dip in the climate no matter what we do here onwards. But if we act quickly, reassures a study based on NASA's Operation Icebridge airborne campaign, we can mitigate the effects of the meltdown. It reckons that in case this torrential meltdown stabilizes within a century, the melting rate in Greenland could fall to as low as 25% of its mass by 3000 CE. The rise of skepticism in the face of such overwhelming evidence supporting climate change is indeed appalling. It also seems to be a futile attempt to deny the impending predicament at hand, since denying imminent climate change is tantamount to losing large parts of inhabited lands, jeopardizing millions of lives across the world, and ultimately leading the planet to a complete climatic collapse, from which we might never recover. Given all this, we aren't showing enough earnestness, much less contemplating the seriousness of the consequences. We are in the beginning of a mass extinction, retorted Greta Thunberg, an indignant climate change activist. And all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth? How dare you? She lashed out at the UN General Assembly. Her fiery words triggered worldwide protests as young children took to the streets in almost 100 countries around the world. With no respite from the crisis at hand, and since the numbers are looking as bleak as they are, we are left to ponder the desperate moral question. Are humans worth melting for? Thank you for listening. For more such podcasts and news, please log on to www.researchmatters.in.